I sat at the edge of my own dining room and listened to a silence that did not belong to me. The lilies from the service still held their sweet bite. His aftershave clung to the cuff of my sweater like a hand that could not let go. I placed the silver tie clip on the table and waited for my breath to even out. Have you ever walked through your house and felt like a guest? I did that night. The email arrived before dawn. Estate administration meeting. Wednesday. 9 o'clock. No greeting. No how are you holding up. I read it twice and felt the weight shift inside my chest. Grief makes people soft. Power makes people careless. I boiled cinnamon tea and told myself to be steady. The lobby of her firm smelled like eucalyptus and printer ink. Cold and clean. A young receptionist glanced at my shoes, then passed me, as if the air behind me had more business than I did. I folded my hands and waited to be called. In the glass of the conference room I saw my reflection. A widow without a chair. Inside they sat in a line of dark suits. My daughter-in-law, Tiffany Reynolds Johnson, smiled without teeth. My son Andre looked at the table. No one slid a packet toward me. No one said, Mrs. Johnson, you can sit here. They read off properties and funds like items from a grocery list. I counted my breaths. I had rehearsed kindness. I had not rehearsed erasure. The man at the head of the table cleared his throat. His voice was smooth. There are no remaining distributions assigned to Mrs. Johnson. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I felt something colder than that. I felt my name leave the room. Then a second voice. Late. Come. May I see line 7? A woman I recognized from Will's last good year stepped forward and set down her briefcase. The room shifted its eyes. The man blinked. She looked at the page as if it were a map. Interesting date, she said. Sunday. 7:43 in the evening. Office hours are a kind of truth, are they not? I looked at Tiffany. She held her smile. I held my breath. And that is how the paper began to speak. I woke to a quiet that felt staged. The lilies from the service kept their sweet bite in the hallway. Will's aftershave floated up from the cuff of my sweater when I reached for the light. I sat at the table and set his silver tie clip in the center like a compass. My house did not feel like my house. It felt borrowed. If you have ever walked through your own doorway and felt like a guest, you know the kind of hush I am talking about. Before dawn, an email slid into my inbox. Estate administration meeting. Wednesday. 9 o'clock. No greeting. No I hope you are holding up. No signature beyond an assistant's typed name. I read it twice and thought grief can make people soft. Power can make them careless. I boiled cinnamon tea and stood at the sink until the water ran clear. I told myself to be steady. I placed the tie clip in my purse like a small anchor and went to dress. The lobby of Tiffany's firm lived inside cold colors and smooth echoes. The kind of place that makes you check your voice and your posture. Eucalyptus and printer ink made a faint blend in the air. A young receptionist met my eyes for half a second, and then looked past my shoulder as if the hallway behind me had more reason to be there than I did. I folded my hands in my lap and waited for my name. I saw my reflection in the conference room glass. A widow without a chair is a shape you do not forget. They called me in. A long table. Dark suits. White cups. Neat folders like fences between people. My daughter-in-law, Tiffany Reynolds Johnson, sat at the head. Her hair was smoothed back tight and her smile did not show teeth. My son Andre sat halfway down. He looked at the table with a kind of devotion that made my chest ache. No one slid a packet toward me. No one said, Mrs. Johnson, you may sit here beside me. I took the empty chair at the far end and folded my hands again. The first voice spoke like an elevator bell. Calm and practiced. He listed properties. A commercial lot near the Beltline. A set of stocks in companies with long names. The partial ownership of a vineyard that Will had joined with old friends in his better years. He said numbers as if they were cities he had visited. I watched the light swim across the polished wood and counted my breath. I had rehearsed kindness for this day. I had not rehearsed erasure. The second voice belonged to Tiffany. She did not stand. She did not greet me. She said, as executor, I will walk us through the distribution of assets as laid out in the finalized will. She touched the top page with one finger as if blessing a child. The man beside her turned the next sheet and continued with a tone that felt like a metronome. A trust had been amended. Control had been transferred 6 months ago. He said the month and the date. I remembered where Will had been that week. In our living room with a blanket around his knees. He had asked me for an orange. I had brought 2. He had eaten half and laughed that his mouth felt like paper. He had not walked well that week. He had not signed anything in our house that week. No one asked me for a question. No one asked me for a memory. The man cleared his throat. His final sentence landed like an iron lid. There are no remaining distributions assigned to Mrs. Johnson. I did not gasp. I did not cry. Tears would have been a kindness I did not owe that room. I felt something colder and cleaner than tears. I felt my name stand up and walk out of the door without me. I watched Tiffany's smile hold its line. Andre's hand shifted on his pen and then went still. The door opened. The air moved in a new way. The woman who stepped in did not look hurried. She moved as if time had offered her a chair and she took it. I knew her. Not well. Enough to remember the year Will still had his voice clear and his appetite steady. Anita Patel. Probate attorney with the kind of patience that feels like a mirror. Pardon my delay, she said. May I see the working copy? The man with the metronome voice blinked. Tiffany did not move for a heartbeat. Then she slid a folder an inch. Anita did not take her eyes off the page when she spoke again. Line 7, please. The room shifted its eyes without moving its heads. The man found the place with his finger and held it there while Anita leaned in. She did not smile. She read. The silence changed shape. Then she said 4 words that did not raise her voice. Interesting date. Sunday evening. She tapped the margin once with her pen. 7:43. She did not look at me. She did not have to. I felt a door inside me tilt on its hinge. The man coughed. Office hours are fluid, he said. Anita nodded as if she had heard the weather reported. Of course, she said. And yet office access logs are not fluid. She lifted her eyes to him with a softness that still managed to hold weight. I would like a certified copy of the executed version, and any prior drafts with visible markup. Tiffany placed both hands on the table. We can provide what is appropriate, she said. The way she shaped the word appropriate carried a quiet warning. Anita's eyes did not move from the page. Of course, she said again. Her voice felt like a level placed on a shelf. The meeting resumed its rhythm, but the room had changed. People shifted in their seats without meaning to. Someone cleared a throat that did not need clearing. I sat still and let the sound wash around me. I looked at the light on the wood again. I did not pick up the pen that had been left near my elbow. I did not offer to sign a thing. When it ended, there was no handshake for me. The air in the hallway felt colder than the room had felt. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button with the gentlest part of my finger. In the lobby, the eucalyptus smell found me again, and I almost smiled because it reminded me of a time we visited a small spa near Savannah where Will had laughed at the steam and said he felt like a dumpling. I held that small memory in my hand until I reached the street. Outside, the morning had sharpened. The wind found the open edge of my coat and slipped in with a little sting. I did not cry. I did not feel anger. Not yet. I felt a clean emptiness that can hold something if you do not rush it. I walked to my car and sat with my hands on the wheel. I spoke out loud for the first time since the sentence landed. They took my name off a life I helped build. On the drive home, the city kept moving with no awareness that anything had been tilted inside one woman's chest. A bus opened its doors. A boy ran for it and made it. A woman on a corner turned her face to the sun. I parked in my driveway and let the engine tick itself quiet. I pressed my fingers to my wrist and felt my pulse. Steady. Then I went inside and made tea. Ms. Lorraine called before the water boiled. Her voice can carry a whole Sunday supper in one sentence. Baby, she said, I heard there was a long table and short memory. The choir has faster feet than the male. I made a sound that was not a laugh and not a cry. We do not own rumor, I said. But we know its walk. She asked if I needed anything. I told her I had tea and a roof. She said she would stop by later with cornbread anyway, and that Pastor Green had asked after me. Tell him I am still here, I said. Tell him light takes its time, but it is not lazy. After I hung up, I set my tea on Will's old coaster and listened to the house. The coat rack clicked as it settled. The heater breathed and then rested. The refrigerator hummed a half note. I stood up and went to his study. The air in there held the faint weight of paper and pencil. The drawer with the sticky slide made its familiar squeak. He used to promise to oil it. I used to promise to miss that sound if he did. I did not go hunting. My hands went where they needed. Under a cloth-bound ledger was a thin manila folder with no label. I opened it and saw his handwriting. A draft with the kind of uneven line that illness gives your hand. He had written about clarity. He had written the word discuss twice. He had underlined my name once. In the margin near a sentence about protections, he had written a note that made my throat tight. Discuss with Tiffany. I sat back and held the folder as if it could bruise. The ceiling fan made its slow turn. The light on the desk softened in a way that makes you think of late summer. I read the page again. I turned to the second sheet. It was a photocopy of a more recent will. The printed line that had once held my name as a beneficiary wore a red slash. In the margin, a small note waited with no signature. Per our discussion. I closed my eyes and saw our kitchen a year ago. I had made fish and rice and small greens with onion. He had reached across the table and squeezed my wrist and said, "You will not have to worry. Promise you that." Then he had released me like a man who hated to let go of any warm thing. I pressed my palm to my heart and let the promise sit with the paper like two guests who did not yet know each other. I copied the pages and placed the copies in the lockbox with our passports and the old insurance forms. Then I took the original folder and slid it under Will's National Geographic stack in the hall closet. A bright yellow spine can hide a great many truths if you let it. I sat at the edge of the bed with my hands open on my knees until the air in the room felt less tight. Before dinner I stepped onto the porch and watched the block stretch itself into evening. Mr. Carter across the street watered his small azaleas and waved his hat. A child rode past on a bike with a basket full of library books. The sky lowered itself into a blue that made the streetlights think about their duty. I felt the day settle into the place between. Not light. Not dark. Waiting. My phone buzzed. A number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered. A calm voice spoke my full name with respect. "Mrs. Claudia May Johnson. This is Anita Patel. I thought you might want company on a road that does not have signs yet." I breathed in and felt my ribs move like a respectful choir. I said, "I am listening." She said, "I will not ask you to talk about feelings. I will ask for copies. I will ask for dates and times. I will ask for permission to request logs from an office that does not work on Sundays." I said, "I can do that." She said, "There is a line that matters and it is called 7. I said, "I know." She said, "Good." Then she said, "Rest if you can." I thanked her and looked back at my street. Someone somewhere turned a radio up just enough that the melody reached me in pieces. It sounded like an old gospel song walking home. I went inside and made a plate of leftover chicken and sat at my table with the silver tie clip in the center. I spoke toward the clip and not toward the air. "You could have told me. You did not. I will not hold that against you. But I will walk this all the way to daylight." When I finished eating, I washed the plate and left it to dry. I wiped the table and returned the tie clip to my purse. I wrote 3 lines in my notebook and underlined the word Sunday. I added the time that Anita had said out loud. 7:43. I closed the book and laid my hand on it. That night before sleep I prayed without a lot of words. I thanked God for patience and for Anita and for Ms. Lorraine's cornbread. I asked for a spine made of something kinder than anger and harder than sorrow. I asked for the right question at the right time. I asked for the strength to keep my voice low and my facts high. In the morning I would call Anita. I would tell her about the manila folder and the red mark and the way my name had vanished on paper before it tried to vanish in a room. I would tell her I had no taste for spectacle. I had a taste for truth. I would tell her I did not want revenge, I wanted air. I wanted the kind of space where a woman can stand all the way up in her own name. For now I turned out the light and let the house breathe. The night was not kind and was not cruel. It was simply honest. Told me one thing. Paper speaks. And when it does not shout. Just refuses to lie. I woke before the sun and opened every blind in the house. I wanted light to stand in every room like a witness. Steam rose from my cup and fogged the window for one slow breath. I wrote a list and put numbers beside each line. 1. Call Anita. 2. Copy the pages again. 3. Hold steady. 4. Remember that truth walks, it does not run. Anita answered on the second ring. Her voice carried coffee and order. She asked for a brief summary in my own words. I told her about the sentence at the table, and the way my name felt when it left the room. I told her about the manila folder and the red slash and the small note that said discuss with Tiffany. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she asked for times and dates the way a nurse asks for symptoms. I read from my notebook. She said thank you and then put my day in sequence. Bring clean copies and come in at 10. I dressed with care. Not for them. For me. A soft blouse and a cardigan will always liked. I pinned a small brooch that used to belong to my mother, and told myself that history does not vanish when paper tries to erase it. Ms. Lorraine rang the bell and handed me a foil-covered dish. Cornbread. She did not step inside because she knows the rhythm of a woman getting ready to fight with quiet facts. She said, "Baby, you call me if anybody looks at you wrong." I told her she would be the first to know. Anita's office sat on the 7th floor of an old brick building with clean lines and wide windows. The receptionist spoke my name with respect and water appeared without me asking. Anita met me in the hall and walked me to a room that had a long table but no fences of folders. She placed a legal pad in front of me and asked if I would tell it again from the top. Not for drama. For record. I told it. When I spoke the words office hours are a kind of truth, she nodded once and wrote Sunday in tidy letters. We walked through the steps. She would seek certified copies of the executed amendment. She would request the building access logs for that Sunday. She would ask the notary to confirm presence. She would ask the witness to confirm presence. She would request the email that set the drafting meeting. She would ask for any prior drafts with my name still present. She would ask the court clerk to verify the case numbers attached to each filing. She would do this with focus, not noise. Before I left, she handed me a simple handout printed on plain paper. It explained what a preservation notice means, what discovery can look like, and how a motion to freeze assets works. She told me she was not filing that motion yet. We would collect first and file when we had more than a feeling. I nodded. Feelings do not travel far alone. Facts ride farther. At home, I opened Will's desk and took out the leather planner. The pencil marks lived in his hand like a familiar river. Doctor visits. Lunch with Andre. A few notes that simply said rest. On a Tuesday 3 months before he died, he had written Hal and circled it twice. I pressed my thumb to the circle and took a breath. I called Anita and told her. She asked if I remembered Hal's last name. Givens, I said. She hummed the way a person does when a piece clicks into place. She would reach out to him. She asked me to bring the planner itself, not only the photo. At noon, I ate a piece of cornbread and a small bowl of soup and sat with the planner open beside my plate. I traced the soft dent his pencil had made where he wrote my name next to a dentist appointment. He had written Claudia with a flourish at the end. It looked like a ribbon. I let my finger rest on that curl and spoke out loud. "I will do right by your ribbon, love." Anita called at 2. Hal remembered Will. He agreed to meet us at a small cafe off Peachtree at 4. I changed my shoes, took the folder of copies, and left before I could think of reasons to stay. The cafe smelled like butter and coffee and old wood. The booths looked like they had held long talks that ended in better days. Hal looked tired in the careful way men who know numbers look. He shook my hand with both of his. He did not rush. He did not perform sadness. He let quiet sit with us for a moment and then began. He said Will had come to him thin and polite. He said Will asked questions about survivor protections for me. He said Will wanted to be sure that I would not have to carry the weight of decisions in a season of grief. He said they discussed an independent review of the trust and that he had offered to schedule it. A week later, a call came from Tiffany's office. The review was no longer needed. He did not fight that decision. He might have. He did not. He kept intake notes. He gave a copy to Anita and she placed it in a thin folder labeled intake. Twist. Hal still had the intake notes and the date matched Will's planner. The words survivor protection sat on the page like a promise that had not been allowed to stand. When Hal left, he squeezed my hand again and said, "I am sorry for the way money tries to tell love what it is worth." I told him money has a loud voice but a short breath. Anita tapped her pen on the table once. Then she said, "We will need the notary history and the witness names." I asked Anita if a Sunday signature without presence could undo a life with presence. She did not lecture me. She said it can open a door. Then she added that doors do not open themselves. We have to turn the handle with straight wrists. I smiled and asked if she meant courage. She said she meant paper first. Courage next. I laughed once and felt the sound do me some good. At home I copied Hal's notes for my own binder and labeled the tab Daylight. I cooked rice and peas and set a plate aside for Ms. Lorraine, who always brings a dish and forgets to take one. She came by after choir practice with a voice full of songs and the news of small things. Mr. Carter had cut his azaleas wrong again. The youth group planned a car wash. Pastor Green had preached on truth as light. I told her the bare bones of my day. She put her warm hand on my shoulder and said, "Keep walking, baby." The way she said it steadied me more than food. That night I dreamed that paper grew roots and tied itself to my porch. I woke before dawn with the dream still warm on my skin. I made tea and moved around the house, placing small order on things that had been set aside. I put 3 sweaters back where they belonged. I watered the fern we'll always forgot. I opened the hall closet and touched the yellow spines of the magazines that covered the folder. I told them thank you for being sturdy. At 9 Anita called with a careful tone that meant forward motion. The firm had responded to her request. They sent a scanned copy of the executed amendment. She would pick up a certified copy from the clerk once it posted. She had also reached the notary listed on the document. He remembered a late hour signing but could not confirm who was in the room. He would check his book. She had located one witness name. That person had moved firms. She would track her down. She had also requested the building access records for the week before and after that Sunday. I sat with my notebook and wrote 3 pages. I wrote the sentence from the table at the top so I would not forget the taste of it. I wrote the date and the time and the room and the smell and the way my fingers felt on the chair. I wrote what Anita said. I wrote what Tiffany did not say. I wrote the way Andre looked at the table, and I wrote the way my name felt when it left the room. I wrote Sunday in large letters and then wrote the time, 7:43 in the evening. I underlined it once. I did not strike through anything. I let the page hold me. Anita called before dinner. She had reached the former assistant at the firm. Her name was Ava Kendall. She had moved to a small practice on the other side of town. She had agreed to speak. Anita asked if I would join. I said yes. She said Ava did not want trouble. She wanted clean air. I said so do I. We met Ava in a quiet room with one window and a kind plant in the corner. She was younger than I expected and older in her eyes. She held a small planner in both hands like a book she loved. Anita spoke first and set the shape of the meeting with care. We were not here to accuse. We were here to remember. Ava turned to a page marked with a ribbon. She read her own handwriting in a steady voice. Sunday, 7:43. Witness signature for R. No P present. She lifted her eyes and said she had written R for her boss and P for the principal signer. That night she had been asked to witness a signature. She had not seen Will. When she asked, she was told he had just stepped out. She remembered the smell of takeout in the hall, and the way the copier ran like a restless dog. She had not felt right. She wrote the note because writing is how she keeps herself honest. Twist. A line in a planner from a quiet woman now stood like a small post hammered into the ground, pointed in one direction. Sunday did not hold what the document claimed. Anita asked if she would be willing to sign a short statement that reflected her note. Ava said yes. She did not look brave. She looked ready. Anita asked about emails. Ava remembered a subject line that read revised structure. She remembered the phrase remove co-beneficiary privileges. She had not kept a copy. She had kept the sense that something had leaned too far. We thanked her. When she left the room, I pressed my hand to my chest and felt the slow lift that comes when a knot begins to loosen. Anita wrote 3 lines and drew a box around the word planner. She said the next step was to get the building logs. She also wanted to cross-check the case number on the executed filing against the prior draft. She said sometimes numbers tell stories even when people do not. The next day held small moves that felt like inches. Anita sent the preservation notice to the firm again with a timestamp. She sent a courtesy note to the clerk. She called building management and left a message that included the exact time. She drafted a narrow request for email headers from the firm for the 6 weeks before Will died. She did not demand. She asked with the kind of politeness that sounds like a signed delivery receipt. I cleaned the kitchen because waiting does not like a messy counter. I opened the hall closet and moved the magazines aside long enough to hold the manila folder again. I looked at Will's hand on the page. I touched the word discuss. I felt a hot swell of anger, and then I let it move through the room without settling. I told the air I would not carry anger to the table where truth needs a clear plate. I slid the folder back under the bright yellow and closed the door. In the afternoon, Andre came by and sat at my table with his hands in his pockets. He said he believed it was clean because Tiffany said it was clean. I told him to read with his own eyes. He looked at the tie clip and asked why that gift. I said small gifts often cover large truths. He nodded and said he would read line 7. Morning brought a call from building management. Anita looped me in on speaker. The woman on the line said the building had limited staff on Sundays. The door logs could be produced. She would need a written request and a small fee. Anita thanked her and sent both before the call ended. We waited. Waiting is a muscle. Mine grew strong across years of marriage and mothering in classrooms and hospital rooms. I could wait. I would not drift. By noon the logs arrived as a scan. Anita read them first and then sent them to me with a note that said call me when you are ready. I made tea and sat down and opened the file. The list showed entries and exits with times like beads. Saturday had beads. Monday had many beads. Sunday evening at 7:43 showed no bead for Will. The main doors showed no bead for him at any hour that day. A service entrance showed no activity. A freight elevator key showed no use. I felt the tea cool and did not drink it. Climax. The log did not hold his name. The paper at the table had held a time that did not belong to him. Anita picked up on the first ring. She spoke like a woman who had planted something and seen a leaf. We have a clean gap, she said. We have a witness note. We have intake notes. We have a prior draft with your name. We will seek the email. We will seek the notary book. We will seek the case number path. Then she paused and added one word. Patience. The next morning Anita and I met with the clerk at the county office. The clerk wore glasses that made her look like she could read the soul of a page. Anita asked for a search of prior filings related to Will's estate. The clerk typed and clicked and hummed an old tune under her breath. She printed 2 sheets and pointed with a pencil. She said the earlier draft had been superseded, but the cross-reference field looked strange. She said sometimes a document gets pushed through under the wrong case number, and no one notices because grief makes families quiet and busy. Anita asked for certified copies. The clerk nodded and told us to check back by afternoon. Outside the courthouse, Anita stood still and watched a cloud move. Then she said the next piece is the notary book and the witness statement. She would also draft a narrow request for a few emails and call logs. We would still hold the motion for later. She wanted to walk in with more than a map. She wanted to walk in with landmarks. In the afternoon, Ava returned my message. She was willing to sign a statement that matched her planner note. She did not want a scene. She wanted her part to be clear. We met in Anita's office. Anita read the statement out loud and Ava corrected 1 comma and 1 time zone notation. Then she signed and dated it. She set her pen down with a care that felt like a kindness to herself. Climax. The moment Ava signed, I felt the room tilt toward me. Not in fear. In balance. It was as if a table that had wobbled under a heavy dish found its 4th leg. When Ava left, I thanked her for writing when she was not sure it would matter. She said writing is how I know I am not making things up when my stomach is loud. I told her that wisdom would feed her child better than any raise. Anita and I sat in the quiet after the door closed. She said we have enough to request more without sounding like a storm. She would prepare a short preservation order if any activity appeared on the accounts. She would draft the motion to freeze and hold it in the drawer. When the time was right, we would file. I went home and stood in the doorway of Will's study and let the late light pool on the desk. I touched the planner. I touched the folder. I touched the tie clip. I told him I was still here and that I was learning to let paper speak for me when my voice wanted to rise. I boiled tea and sat at the table and wrote a new list. 1. Keep records clean. 2. Stay soft where I can and firm where I must. 3. Tell the truth even when it does not clap. 4. Sleep. Quiet investigation had moved from wish to work. We did not shout. We gathered. We named. We dated. We kept the pages flat and the corners neat so no one could say the mess was ours. The morning began with a sky that could not decide between silver and blue. I folded a dish towel and set it on the counter as if that small order could steady a day that might tilt. Anita called at 8. Her voice was clear. We have the building logs. We have Ava's statement. We have Hal's intake notes in your copies. I am drafting 2 things. A narrow request for internal emails. A motion to freeze the estate accounts in case activity starts before the clerk processes our requests. I will not file the motion today unless the accounts show movement. I want you ready if we need to file by noon. I thanked her and stood very still. The house made its soft sounds. A cardinal tapped once on the edge of the porch rail. I set the phone down and opened my notebook. I wrote the words "hold steady" and then I underlined them 1 time. I wrote the names of each person who had put a clean hand on this truth. Hal, Ava, the clerk, Ms. Lorraine, Pastor Green, Anita. I looked at the list and felt less alone than I had felt in weeks. At 9:30 Anita called again. A junior associate at Tiffany's firm had replied to her courtesy email. The note said they had received our preservation notice and would comply as appropriate. It also said any requests for email archives should be routed through counsel with agreed search terms. Anita had anticipated the word appropriate. She asked for 2 terms first. Revised structure. Co-beneficiary privileges. She asked for a narrow time window. 6 weeks before Will's last hospitalization. She added a polite line requesting that all deletions be suspended. She sent it with a read receipt. I waited with tea and plain toast. Waiting is a skill and a burden. My hands wanted to clean every drawer in the kitchen. My feet wanted to walk the block and then walk it again. I stood at the sink and watched a line of sunlight move across the porch. It stopped at the threshold as if asking permission before entering. I said, "Come in." At 10:15 Anita called. The bank reported a login to one of the estate accounts at 9:52. The login came from a device on file with the firm. No funds had moved yet. She had triggered an alert with the bank officer that any internal transfer or external transfer above a small threshold would pause and request secondary authorization. She said this was a courtesy procedure some banks extend when a preservation notice is in place. She wanted me to know we had a small guardrail and not a full fence. She said, "Be near your phone." I sat down and wrote 1 line on a blank page. Do not run beside a moving train. Wait for the platform. Then I stood and washed a plate that was already clean. At 11 a courier dropped an envelope on my porch. Inside was a polite letter from a senior partner at Tiffany's firm. It accused me of interfering with a lawful transition and suggested my actions were motivated by confusion and grief. It threatened to seek fees if I did not withdraw informal requests. I read it once. I read it again. Then I placed it flat on the table and smoothed the corners with my palm. I did not feel anger. I felt a kind of clarity that arrives when someone speaks too confidently in the wrong direction. Anita called before I had to decide what the letter should mean to me. She said, "Do not respond." She said, "Let paper answer paper." She said we would add the letter to our stack called Tone. Then she paused and said, "Claudia, I just received the first email covering the term revised structure. It is dated 6 weeks before Will died. It is marked confidential. It reads in part expedite final documents and remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion." She stopped and let the air hold the sentence. I leaned back in my chair and pressed my hand to my chest. I could feel my heart do 3 slow beats and then steady itself as if it knew I was watching. Anita said we will request the rest of the thread and any attachments. We will also confirm whether the executed version reflects that instruction. We will not accuse. We will present. Twist. The phrase "remove co-beneficiary privileges" had moved from rumor to document. It sat on a page with a date that mattered. By noon Anita called with a decision. The bank officer had seen a preparatory action on an estate sub-account. It did not move funds yet. It set up a scheduled distribution for the next day. Anita said, "This is the platform. I will file the motion now." I asked if she needed me at the courthouse. She said no. She wanted me at home in case the bank or the clerk called. She would have a hearing time by afternoon. She said, "Eat something." I made a sandwich and ate it standing by the window. I watched a delivery truck stop and start down the block. The driver waved to a child who waved back with both hands. I finished my food and washed the plate and set it to dry. Then I sat with my notebook and wrote gratitude in a small box. Under it I listed simple things. The window. The tea. The clerk's glasses. The way Anita says we will not accuse, we will present. I closed the book and waited for the next ring. At 1:30, Anita called with her voice dressed for court. The judge had set a brief hearing for 3. The motion would ask for a temporary freeze on estate accounts and a hold on property transfers until the court could review our early material. The motion attached the building logs, Ava's note, Hal's intake, and a copy of the email header showing revised structure with the request for the full content under seal. The motion did not accuse anyone of a crime. It asked for time and air. She told me to be ready to join by phone if the judge asked to hear from me. I changed my blouse and pinned my mother's brooch again. I sat in the quiet and prayed in a steady line with no fancy edges. I asked for a fair ear and a clear hour. I asked for mercy on every person who had told a small lie because someone powerful asked them to. I asked for a heart that could hold victory without cruelty. At 3, Anita called and patched me into the hearing. I heard the judge's voice first. It sounded like a street with trees. Anita laid out the motion in calm sentences. She said there were irregularities that deserved daylight. She said the building logs and the planner note showed a question at the hour of execution. She said the email suggested that language had been removed in a way that changed the position of a widow. She said a temporary freeze would prevent harm while the court examined the documents. The judge asked one question about the scope. Anita narrowed it to essential accounts and property titles. Counsel for the firm spoke next. He said the estate administration had been proper. He said the widow was grieving and mistaken. He said delays might harm charitable timelines and business obligations. He did not address the Sunday time. He did not mention the email phrase. He used the word appropriate 2 times and the word unfortunate 1 time. The judge paused long enough that I could hear the paper on his desk shift. Then he granted a temporary freeze for 10 days. He said the court would revisit upon receipt of certified copies and any additional records the parties produced. He said a quick follow-up and thanked counsel for their courtesy. The line clicked. Anita exhaled one short sound and then said, "It is granted. The room you need to breathe now belongs to you for 10 days. Climax. The court had handed us time. Not revenge. Space. I put the phone down and let my shoulders lower by an inch. I walked to the sink and splashed cool water on my face and then stood by the back door until the air felt like a friend again. The porch boards creaked once like an old man shifting his weight. I smiled without meaning to. At 4, a new email arrived from the firm. It confirmed receipt of the order. It said they would comply while reserving all rights. It included a list of accounts and properties subject to the freeze. I printed it and placed it under a paperweight shaped like a small bird that will found at a flea market in Macon. Then I called Ms. Lorraine and told her only what a community needs to know. The court paused the hands that were moving. She said "Sweet Jesus" under her breath and then she laughed like a kettle coming to boil. She said, "Come get a slice of sweet potato pie because justice is easier to hold with something warm." I walked over at dusk. Her house smelled like cinnamon and years of fellowship. We sat at the small table and ate in the quiet way women eat when a day has asked a lot from them. She said, "Baby, I am proud of the way you stood still." She said, "There is a kind of fight that looks like a hand on a shoulder. You found it." I told her I had help. She nodded and said the wind has helped too, but it still carries its own name. When I got home, Anita had left a voicemail. The clerk's office had located the prior draft line where my name sat under the phrase survivor protections. A certified copy would be ready in the morning. The notary had also called back. He had found his book. He had logged a witness signature on that Sunday evening under initials that could be his own shorthand for the senior partner or for Tiffany. He could not say. He had not written Will's name on the line for signer. He had written a dash. He would scan the page to us. He sounded unsettled. I stood in Will's study and felt the floor under my feet like a firm hand. I pulled the manila folder from under the magazines and held it in the light from the desk lamp. I read his uneven lines again. Discuss with Tiffany. I touched the word discuss and told it that I had shown up to the discussion even if I had not been invited. I set the folder down and placed the tie clip on top of it for a moment like a small seal. The next morning Anita and I met again at her office. She had printed the email we had received in full. Revised structure sat in the subject line in a way that made my stomach tighten. The body of the message was simple. Finalize documents this week. Remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion. Expedite scheduling. It had a small footer with a confidentiality warning. and a timestamp that aligned with the week Hal remembered. Anita slid another page toward me. It was a timeline she had drawn in plain ink. Planner entry. Email. Office log. Notary book with a dash. Executed filing. Twist. The pieces formed a line that did not curve. It pointed to a process that had leaned past what is clean. Anita said we would issue a narrow subpoena for the email chain and attachments. She said the court would likely allow it under seal. She said we would also request the case number path from the clerk in writing. She said the more we let the pages talk, the less we would need our voices to carry them. She smiled without showing her teeth, and I felt a warmth I did not expect to feel in a room with a copy machine. Andre called at noon and asked if he could stop by. He came with his shoulders tight and his eyes tired. He sat at the table and looked at the tie clip as if it could explain itself. He said Tiffany was angry. He said she called the freeze an insult. He said he did not know who to be loyal to. I told him loyalty without truth is only fear with a suit on. I told him to read line 7 with his own eyes. He asked if I wanted him to leave her. I told him I wanted him to stand upright. He nodded and looked younger than he had looked to me in years. In the afternoon the clerk called. The certified copy was ready. Anita picked it up and brought it to me so I could see the seal with my own eyes. There it was. The sentence that held my name as a beneficiary in Will's words before the edits. Survivor protections for my wife, Claudia Mae Johnson. I traced the air over the words and did not touch the paper. I said hello to the woman my husband had tried to protect when he still had his strong hand. I let myself feel sorrow for the ways he had trusted convenience in his tired season. Then I let that sorrow pass through me without building a home. Anita sat across from me and spoke with care. This is the moment where people want to rush. Do not. We will send this to opposing counsel and to the court with a simple cover. We will add that we seek a short discovery window to collect the email thread and any versions between this draft and the executed one. We will keep our language calm. We will keep the facts straight. The judge will see the line. I asked Anita what happens next. She said likely a call from the firm. Likely a tone that wants to turn this into a misunderstanding. Possibly a conversation about preserving the foundation's reputation. Possibly a quiet step back by someone who prefers air to flame. She said do not be surprised by a statement that admits nothing and relieves pressure. She said the goal was not confession. It was correction. That evening I walked along the block and felt the city do what cities do. Cars turned corners and found places to be. A woman laughed into a phone and then grew quiet as she listened. A dog stood guard over a yard of clover as if it were acres. I passed the community center and I had helped fund in a better year, and watched a girl practice a dance step in the reflection of the window. She repeated the same move until she found it. My eyes stung in a clean way and then cleared. When I came home there was an email from Anita. The firm had responded. They would not contest the temporary freeze. They would provide the chain for revised structure under seal. They were reviewing internal procedures. They did not admit to wrongdoing. They did not address Sunday. They did not speak my name. Anita added one line below their message. Doors move on hinges that prefer oil to arguments. Climax. The room that had once felt like it would always belong to someone else had shifted. We did not raise our voices. We raised our receipts. The court gave us time. The pages gave us direction. The people who had seen small things gave us their notes and their names. I placed my hand flat on the table and felt the grain under my palm. Felt like a road. I brewed tea and sat in the quiet. I wrote another list. Preserve. Request. Confirm. Hold. Then I added a line that was not about paper. Rest. I took the tie clip in my hand and closed my fingers around it. I thought of Will standing in the doorway on a good morning, sunlight on his left shoulder, asking if I wanted coffee first or the news. I answered him in the room that did not hold him and said both. Then I set the tie clip down and turned off the light. The night felt honest again. It told me we had moved from pain to proof. From proof to pause. Tomorrow would bring its own shape. Tonight I could sleep. The invitation arrived on a cream card that tried to look gentle. It named a tribute at the country club, and a short board session to confirm executive oversight for the foundation. There was no mention of the freeze. There was no mention of Sunday. There was no mention of me beyond Ms. Johnson is welcome to attend. I set the card beside my tea and looked at it until it looked back. Then I called Anita. She listened to me read the words. She did not sigh. She said the card is theater. She said a stage can be a place to humiliate or a place to let truth walk across without tripping. She asked me what I wanted. I told her I wanted presents, not a scene. She said bring the packets we prepared. Bring the certified copy that shows survivor protections for my wife Claudia May Johnson. Bring Ava's statement. Bring the email that carries revised structure. Bring the building log page that holds a quiet 0 for Sunday. She said I would not need a speech. Paper would do the speaking. Ms. Lorraine came over with a scarf and a prayer. She sat at my table and watched me arrange the packets by name. Each packet held the same 4 pages in the same order. She nodded at the neatness. Then she took my hands and said, "Baby, you will not let your blood pressure argue with your dignity. Breathe. Sit tall. Pass the truth and leave the room walking." Her voice settled something inside me that had been ready to run. The afternoon came dressed in polished wood and calm lighting. The country club lobby smelled like furniture polish and lemon. The portraits on the wall looked down with the kind of patience money buys. I walked past them without lowering my eyes. A young attendant handed me a program that used words like legacy and continuity. In the large room, a photograph of Will stood on an easel near the bar. It was the one Tiffany liked because it made him look like a gentle statue. I wanted the one where he was laughing with his mouth open. I swallowed that thought and walked to the quiet side of the room. People approached with the careful smiles of those who think sympathy is an outfit. They said he was a good man. They said the foundation changed lives. They said Tiffany was a natural leader. I nodded and let each sentence pass through me like a breeze that cannot stay. Andre stood across the room with his hands in his pockets. He glanced at me and looked down. His tie was crooked by a whisper. I wanted to fix it. I did not move. The board members took their seats at a long table. I recognized 3 from early years when Will and I carried binders into small rooms and asked for support with the fierce hope of young partners. The chair cleared his throat and used the word housekeeping. Then he thanked Tiffany for guiding the transition in a difficult season. She stood. She did not look at me. Her smile had been ironed. She spoke about Will's vision. She spoke about stewardship. She spoke about continuity. She used my name once in a sentence that felt like a ribbon that had been cut too short. She said Claudia stood beside Will in the early years and we honor that. She said we now move forward. She thanked donors. She gestured toward the photograph. The room exhaled in a polite ripple of applause. The chair turned the page on his agenda and said the board would now record its final confirmation of executive oversight. He asked if there were any questions before the vote. I stood. I did not speak. I lifted the first packet from my bag and handed it to the man to my left. His eyebrows tilted. He opened it. He passed it to the woman beside him. I lifted the next packet and handed it across the table to another pair of hands. I moved down the length of the table without hurry. The room quieted in the way of rooms that sense a change in weather. The first man reached the page with the building log. He tapped the date with his finger. He leaned toward his neighbor and whispered one word. Sunday. A woman near the middle reached the certified copy and read the sentence about survivor protections. I saw her mouth the words "my wife." A third member lifted the email and held it closer to his glasses. He looked up at Tiffany and then back at the page. The chair asked, "What is this?" I said, "It is what you should see before you vote." Anita stepped into the room with the grace of someone who has already found the chair she needs. She introduced herself without flourish. She said, "I represent Mrs. Johnson in matters related to the estate and to language that concerns her position in her late husband's trust." She said there are irregularities that deserve daylight. She did not accuse. She did not label. She simply stood where the air could carry her words to every ear. Tiffany spoke for the first time since her speech. She said these are private legal documents and this is an inappropriate setting for them. Anita nodded and said every person who has accepted fiduciary responsibility is obliged to consider whether a vote today risks a decision that will not stand tomorrow. She held up one page without raising it above her shoulder. She said this is a building access log that shows no entry for the signer at the time recorded on the executed amendment. She set it down. She picked up another page. She said this is a certified copy of a draft that includes survivor protections for Mrs. Johnson. She set it down. She picked up the email printout. She said this is a message that instructs the removal of co-beneficiary privileges 6 weeks before Mr. Johnson passed. She set it down. She did not need to lift Ava's statement. A quiet woman had already written the truth in a planner and signed her name today. Climax. For a moment there was no sound but the room breathing. The chair looked from page to face and back again. He cleared his throat. He asked Tiffany if she had seen the documents. She said her counsel would respond. He said her counsel could respond now. The counsel stood and said the firm was reviewing internal procedures and would cooperate with the temporary court order while reserving all rights. He said nothing about Sunday. He said nothing about survivor protections. He said nothing about the email instruction. The silence wrapped around those omissions like ribbon around an empty box. I felt my knees steady themselves as if the floor had offered me a hand. I looked at Andre. He was not looking at the table anymore. He was looking at me. He stepped forward a pace and then another. He faced the board and said, I asked to believe this process because I did not want to see my mother hurt. I see now that my wanting did not change the hours on a Sunday. He turned toward Tiffany. He spoke soft and clear. We cannot move through a door that is locked by a lie. Then he faced the board again. He said, I ask you to pause any confirmation until this is reviewed. Pastor Green had come as a community guest. He stood in the back with his hands folded. He is not a man who plays to a camera. He lifted one hand and asked to offer one sentence. The chair nodded. The pastor said honest work does not fear the morning. He sat down. The sentence landed with the weight of old truth. The chair looked at the agenda and then looked at the faces around him. He said we will not take a vote today. He said we will appoint a temporary oversight committee comprised of members who served alongside Mr. Johnson in the early years. He said the committee will review the material under counsel and report back. He said the tribute will proceed. He set the agenda aside. He looked at me. He said, Mrs. Johnson, thank you for being present. Release. The room that had tried to make me a visitor returned me to my proper place. Not at the head. Not at the door. In my own name and in my own seat. Tiffany did not approach me. She left the podium and spoke to her counsel in low tones. She looked at Andre. She tilted her head in a way that used to charm people who did not see the price of charm. He did not move toward her. He walked to me. He reached for my hands and then thought better and put them in his pockets. He said, I am sorry, Mama. I said, I know. He said, I did not want to see. I said, I know. He said, I will stand up now. I said, then stand. A few people came to touch my arm with respect. They did not ask for details. They did not offer speeches. They said simple words. We see you. We hear you. We will wait for the review. The kindness was not loud. It was clean. The tribute portion began. A short video showed photographs of Will that did not tell the whole truth but told enough to let strangers feel tender. People spoke about his laugh and his habit of writing notes on napkins. They did not speak about his stubbornness or his habit of avoiding hard talks when he was tired. I sat with both truths in my lap and let them rest there like two birds that do not have to fight. When it ended, I walked to the photograph. I stood close enough to see the reflection of the room in the glass. I did not touch the frame. I whispered, you promised me ease and left me work. Then I smiled because work can be holy when it is honest. I turned and found Ms. Lorraine. She lifted her chin at me and her eyes said all that needed saying. We walked out together. In the lobby, Anita caught up to me. She handed me a simple memo that summarized what had just happened. It included the next steps. The Oversight Committee would request the full email chain under seal. The clerk would provide the certified copies for the court file. The judge would review our motion at the next hearing. Anita would maintain the preservation notice with the bank. She said, do not worry about what anyone says in the gossip lanes. She said gossip is a form of smoke. She said we have the fire under control. On the drive home, the late sun slid low. The city looked less sharp and more human. I passed the small bakery where Will used to buy a cinnamon roll he called a sin and a prayer. I did not stop. I had cornbread at home and a quiet evening to keep. When I reached my porch, there was an envelope without a stamp on the mat. Inside was a note from one of the senior board members. It was handwritten with the tidy script of a man who learned in a time when penmanship was a mark of respect. He wrote thank you for protecting what mattered to Will before he became an institution. He wrote we will be careful. I sat on the porch step and let the words settle like a soft quilt. Later Andre came by. He held a small bag of groceries like a boy trying to bring an offering that can fix the world. He said he wanted to make gumbo the way Will liked it. I let him in and we cooked in the easy silence that belongs to families who have just walked through a wind and are counting dishes to quiet their hands. He asked if I hated Tiffany. I said hate is a leash I do not plan to wear. I said I will not excuse harm. I said I will not carry poison. He nodded. He said he would speak to someone about his own fear. He said he did not want to be a man who chose ease over truth. He looked older. He looked better. That night I called Pastor Green and told him thank you for one sentence carried at the right time. He said that sentence belonged to anyone who needed it. He said I could borrow it again as many times as I liked. I said I would try to rest. He said rest is work too. I smiled and said I would add it to my list. I stood in Will's study with the window open an inch and the night air lifting the curtain in a slow tide. I placed the country club program in the bottom drawer. I opened my notebook and wrote the day in 4 lines. Entered a room that once tried to sit me in the corner. Placed paper into the right hands. Watched truth change the temperature. Walked out standing. I closed the book and laid my palm on the cover. The wood under my hand felt alive. Before sleep I stepped onto the porch. The street held the soft hum of a city ready to put itself to bed. Somewhere a radio sang a hymn under its breath. I spoke to the dark in a low voice. Not revenge. Correction. Not spectacle. Witness. Not noise. Names and dates. I said goodnight to the lilies that still held their bite. I said goodnight to the tie clip on my desk. I said goodnight to the woman who had been erased on paper, and then wrote herself back with ink that does not smear. The next day would belong to committees and clerks and the slow work of pages moving from desk to desk. Tonight belonged to breath. I let it fill me. I let it leave me. I slept without dreaming. The morning after the country club felt lighter, like someone had opened a small window in the night. I made tea and stood at the kitchen sink and watched steam rise and fade. The lilies still held their sweet bite in the hallway. I thought of Will and the way he used to say that air can be full even when a room is quiet. I touched the tie clip and set it down again. I let myself stand still long enough to believe that stillness can be movement when you have been running without legs. By noon a short email arrived from Anita. The firm would not contest the freeze for now. The oversight committee had been seated. A separate line reported that the foundation would issue a public note within the week to explain an interim change. There were no fireworks in those sentences. There was only pace. I made a sandwich and ate it standing by the window like a woman who did not want crumbs on her new hour. In the afternoon a second message arrived. It was from a board member who had served with Will in the early years. He wrote that the committee would pause new directives until review. He wrote that the original intent of the trust would guide their reading. He wrote that he appreciated the clarity of the documents I had shared. I exhaled. The breath felt like it had been waiting for weeks. That evening I walked around the block. The light fell like a soft shawl across the roofs. I passed the community center and saw a group of girls in the after-school room. They were making posters with bright markers. One girl held up a sign that said reading is a door. Another had written help us plant the spring bed. I stood at the window long enough that the staff noticed me and waved. I waved back and put my hand over my heart. Then I kept walking because sometimes gratitude needs motion. The next day Anita called with a tone I knew now. It meant a pivot. She said a letter had arrived from council. They would step back from executive oversight at the foundation. The language did not admit wrongdoing. It said they wished to protect the reputation of the institution and respect the legacy of Mr. Johnson. She read 2 lines aloud. The words fell with a dull grace. Relief does not always throw a party. Sometimes it places a chair where you can sit. I sat at my table and looked at the tie clip and the planner in the manila folder. I thought of the many ways a woman builds a life with a man and the many small decisions that become a home. I thought of the hardest part of grief, which is not the first day or the 5th. It is the way the 10th day asks you to make breakfast and pay the light bill and remember where the key to the shed goes. I touched the planner and thanked Will for every small pencil line that had made me feel seen. Anita asked to meet that afternoon. She arrived with a neat folder and a calm face. She laid out choices on the table the way a nurse lays out instruments. We could pursue damages. We could ask for a formal finding on the document irregularities. We could request a statement that corrected the record about survivor protections. We could close the active portion and keep the preservation notice in place for a period. She said there was no right answer that fit every widow. She said there was only the answer that fit my breath. I looked at the window and at the corner of the yard where marigolds would do well if they were given a chance. I told Anita I did not want to spend my next year in rooms with fluorescent lights and worried faces. I told her I wanted the record to show the line that my husband wrote. I told her I wanted the foundation to be steered by people who knew his early voice. I told her I wanted air. She nodded and took notes with neat strokes. She said we could file a short summary with the court that placed the certified draft alongside the executed version and the building logs. She said we could request that the line about survivor protections be acknowledged in the public file. She said we could call that a correction. I said that word felt right in my mouth. We took a quiet hour to prepare that small package. Anita read every sentence aloud. She corrected one verb and one date. She placed the pages in a simple envelope and wrote the case number without flourish. She said she would file it in the morning. She looked at me and waited. I told her thank you. I told her that a woman can survive a great deal if she is given room to stand in her own name. She said you did more than stand. You placed the chair for the next woman who will need it. On the way home I stopped by the nursery and bought a flat of marigolds and a packet of basil seeds. The clerk asked if I had a plan. I said yes. I said orange at the edges and a line of green near the porch. He smiled and said that sounded like a sunrise. I drove home and sat on the steps and pressed soil into small holes with my thumbs. I planted the marigolds in a ring and the basil in a straight row. I patted the earth and said water will come. It always does. The foundation released a short statement 2 days later. It named the step back. It named the interim oversight. It named the commitment to Mr. Johnson's early mission. It did not name Sunday. It did not name me. It was enough. The local paper carried a small notice on the second page. I cut it out and slid it into the back of the planner. Not because I needed proof. Because history likes a pocket. Andre came by with a bag of soup from a place he liked. He stood in the doorway like a man who is trying to find his shape again. He told me he had spoken to a counselor. He told me he would keep speaking to someone who has a chair and a clock and a kind face. He told me he had asked Tiffany for time apart. He did not speak ill of her. He said he needed to look at his life with both eyes open. I poured soup into bowls and set them on the table. We ate without hurry. He asked if I would forgive him for believing what was easy. I told him I had already saved him a seat the day he was born. I told him he could sit in it any time he chose to do right. He put his hand over mine and did not let go for a long time. Ms. Lorraine came with a pie and the news of the choir. The altos had learned a new line that lifted the roof without breaking it. The youth group had set a car wash for Saturday. Mr. Carter had decided to let his azaleas grow wild this year in honor of his late wife who loved a little chaos in a yard. We laughed and shook our heads. Pastor Green called and said the church would like to archive a few of Will's early speeches and notes for the community room library. I said I had a box. I said I would bring it by. I spent an afternoon with the box. I placed the first grant proposal on top like a crown. I added napkins with scribbles and the first letterhead we ever printed when we had no money for a graphic. I slid in a photograph of Will with 3 teenagers from that first summer program. I wrote a small card that said this is not a monument. It is a map. I tied a string around the box and set it by the door. I walked through the house and adjusted small things. I moved a chair near the window and placed a thin blanket over its back. I set a book of poems on the side table and a new pen next to a small pad. I made a space that invited mornings. I brewed tea and took the first cup into that chair and sat. The marigolds showed themselves at the edge of the porch. They looked like little sons that had agreed to live at eye level. I spoke to the room in a voice that could have been a prayer or a plan. I said I will not chase noise. I will not carry shame that is not mine. I will hold what is mine with 2 hands and let the rest pass. A week later Anita stopped by to close our folder in a gentle way. She brought a summary of the steps we had taken and the documents we had placed on record. She told me the court had accepted our correction. She told me the oversight committee had begun a review. She told me the freeze would expire and the accounts would remain steady while the committee worked. She told me I could call her if anything shifted under my feet. I told her she had given me shoes. She smiled and said I had walked every step myself. I wrote a note to Ava and slid a gift card inside. I thanked her for writing down what she saw and for signing her name when it mattered. I wrote a note to Hal and said that survivor protections are more than a section on a page. I wrote a note to the clerk and thanked her for the way she handled paper as if it were a living thing. I did not write a note to Tiffany. I placed her silence where it belonged and chose to leave it there. Spring moved across the block in small increments. The dogwood shook out white sleeves. The store on the corner put out a rack of straw hats. Children dragged chalk across the sidewalk and left a hopscotch grid that made everyone walk a little more carefully. I walked to the community center with my box and a bag of seed packets the girls could use. The staff greeted me with the easy warmth that comes from years of seeing someone show up. We placed the box in a glass case near the library door. We labeled it early work. I wrote a little line on the card they tucked into the corner. Plant where you will not be here to harvest and call that love. I began to volunteer 2 afternoons a week. I sat with small readers at a round table and listened to them sound out patience and surprise in window and garden. I told them that words have feet. I told them to make sure their words walk in the right direction. One little girl with a red hair bow asked if she could read me a poem she had written about marigolds. I told her I would sit as long as she wanted to read. She smiled with all her teeth and began. Andre called on a Tuesday night to say he had found an apartment not far from the park. He wanted to learn to cook well enough to invite me to dinner and not serve takeout. I told him that Gumbo listens to the cook. I told him I would teach him what my mother taught me. We scheduled Sunday evening for a lesson. He sounded lighter when we hung up. I stood at the sink and cried for exactly 3 minutes. Then I washed my face and felt better. On Saturday I planted a second ring of marigolds and tucked basil seedlings between the stones. A neighbor stopped while I was on my knees and asked if I believed in starting over. I said starting over is a version of staying. It is the part where you choose to remain yourself when the room rearranges the furniture. She laughed and said she would bring coffee next time. The foundation sent me a brief note to ask if I would review a draft of the new scholarship guidelines. The letter used my full name and thanked me for early work. I sat with the draft and made 3 small notes in the margin. One added a line about mentorship. One suggested a clause about family care for students who were parents. One corrected a date. I wrote a final note that said remember that a scholarship is not a gift. It is an agreement to believe in a person before the world does. I sent the draft back and went outside to check on the basil. One evening I drove to the cemetery and parked under an old tree. I walked to Will's headstone and brushed a few leaves away. I told him about the committee and the marigolds and Andre and the girls at the center. I told him about the correction in the court file. I told him about the way a room can shift when you put paper in the right hands. I told him that I had felt angry and then I had felt clean. I stood there until the sky held the color that makes the first star visible. Then I said the thing I had been carrying. You left too much undone. I will not hold that against you. I will carry only what I can carry without dropping myself. On the drive home I turned the radio low and let an old hymn walk with me. The city looked like it belonged to ordinary people again. A woman pulled a grill onto a porch and waved at a neighbor. A man balanced a stack of books on his hip and fumbled for keys with his free hand. A child chalked a crooked sun on the sidewalk and then added a second sun for safety. I reached my street and parked. I sat for a minute before I went inside. I told myself that endings do not have to slam. They can click. I made tea and set it beside the tie clip on the table. I opened my notebook and wrote a final page for this chapter. I wrote that truth had taken its time but had not been lazy. I wrote that paper had spoken without shouting. I wrote that a woman can stand in her name and find that the floor will hold. I wrote that I had learned to say correction instead of revenge and witness instead of spectacle. I wrote that marigolds like full sun and honest water. I wrote that I was not erased. I stood on the porch as night moved in soft. The street held the last sounds of a day that had done its work. A radio played a song in a kitchen. A door closed with care. A cat made a claim on a railing and stared at the moon like a small queen. I thought of all the women who sit in quiet rooms with documents that do not carry their names. I thought of the way a signature can be a door. I thought of the way a planner note can be a lantern. I will end this in the place where I began. At my table. With a cup. With a small metal clip that reminds me that even a thing made to hold fabric can anchor a life for a minute. If you have lived through betrayal, breathe. If you have carried shame that was not yours, set it down. If you have been cut out of a story you helped write, take up a pen. The truth does not always clap. It does not always win a headline. It does not need to. It only needs to stand. If you listen with me all the way to this porch, thank you. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what part of the story held your hand. Subscribe if you want more evenings where a woman sits at a table and tells you how the paper began to speak and how the morning answered.